it. Yes, let me feel that energy. Yes. What I'm talking about. Well, welcome. My name is Bria Willingham, and I am an associate professor of criminal justice at SUNY Plattsburgh. And thank you. And if no one has ever heard of Plattsburgh, if you've heard of Montreal, Canada, then you've heard of Plattsburgh, because I'm just 20 miles from the border. In any case, I am happy to be here at NCHEP again this year, and I am especially delighted to get to introduce our speaker tonight. But before I do that, I want to take care of a couple housekeeping issues. So I have a few announcements. The first one is tomorrow at 7 a.m. there will be a yoga session in the wellness room. So for all the yogis out there, is it yogi or yoga? Which one is it? It's okay. I don't do either one. I don't yoga. So, but for those of you who do, 7 a.m. in the wellness room. Number two, if you are interested in joining the 2020 Planning Committee, the NCHEP Planning Committee, there will be an info session at 8 a.m. in Regency A on the second floor during breakfast. Yes, but if you're up doing yoga, then you'll be ready for the meeting. And finally, tomorrow's plenary session, Rewriting Global Histories of Slavery and Incarceration, a dialogue between two prison history projects, is at 9 a.m. in this same room. So, and I just got a message saying that the live stream link is private, and so I don't know if we can work that out.
I'm gonna work on it. It's right on the national conference page, so it should be fine if they are.
Okay, all right.
I'm gonna check it out.
Well, I will.
I'm working on it. Okay. Keep going.
Okay, so I'll message her in a little bit. Okay, so as I said, it is my distinct pleasure and honor to introduce tonight's keynote speaker, Michelle Jones. Yes, you can give it up for her. If you don't know who Michelle Jones is, you're about to find out. Because anyone doing higher education and prison work should know who Michelle Jones is. And if you don't, we can't be friends, okay? So, case in point, a couple weeks ago, I texted an associate of mine, and I asked if he was going to be here this week. And he said, well, are you presenting this year? And I said, no, but I am introducing Michelle Jones. And he said, oh, what program is she with? I was like, yo, so I just deleted his text, didn't even bother to respond, because we can't be friends. You cannot be doing this work legitimately and don't know who Michelle Jones is. So, no, it's a true story though. But okay, because we're all about educating people, right? So for the newcomers in the room, just in case you don't know who Michelle Jones is, I'll tell you. Michelle Jones is a fierce and unapologetically Black woman who stands firm in her truth because she knows who Michelle Jones is. She is the epitome of how higher education can move a soul, can inspire a soul, can truly change a soul to greatness, whether imprisoned or not. And above all else, her shoe game is dope, okay? So I'm not going to speak long because I actually want to hear what she has to say. So I will say, to partially quote the great singer Lizzo, Michelle Jones is 100% that academic, that activist, that artist. Yeah, y'all thought I was going to say something else, right? I know. So, without further ado, please join me in welcoming tonight's keynote speaker, Michelle Jones.
Thank you, Bria, for that interesting introduction. I've never been introduced like that before. I want her to go everywhere with me from here on out. Okay. So thank you to AHEP and the Keynote Planning Committee for inviting me. I appreciate it.
And before we get started, I think it's important that we honor the land of the ancestors of the Miami and the Sioux and the Osage, that this is their land, and to recognize that the work that we do is sacred work and important work. And the people who came before, we have to acknowledge that they also did important and sacred work on the same land. So that's my shout out for their ancestors as well as mine and as well as yours. So this talk is going to be, I heard that there was some concern that it would be too academic. I heard some people was like, I hope she's not going to be too academic. But this is not card making. This is not card making in the rec building on Tuesday night. This is about people's lives. Okay? So the formerly incarcerated are challenged with establishing ourselves upon release because collateral consequences of criminal convictions, which are legal and social barriers that block and or hinder access to resources and opportunities, they're very real and pressing. And therefore, an advanced degree, an associate, bachelor's, and on represent one of the few accomplishments that can actually counter collateral consequences. So none of us in this room would then say the value of higher education is not all that, right? It's quite the contrary. It's critical and it's important. Yet many of us stand looking upon a horizon of a us versus them paradigm, wherein identity prejudice and recriminalization is the order of the day. So I will argue that that is particularly true of the liberal university and its administrators. So like racism, embedded prejudice toward incarcerated and post-incarcerated people is linked to structural discrimination that produces the indelible taint of criminality. This prejudice is naturalized in society. It's floating in the back of the minds and hearts as a productive othering. Gayatri Spivak's work on the practices of silencing uses the term epistemic violence to explain how this othering happens to the quote-unquote lowest strata of the urban subproletariat in the United States. And Miranda Fricker's work on the believability of witness testimony in legal proceedings look at the ways in which race, sex, and class discrimination intersect with the right of the witness to be a knower, and equivocates what she calls epistemic injustice. Building on their ideas and that of my history project colleague, Anastasia Schmidt, who is right there, I argue that this is also true for the incarcerated and formerly incarcerated in this country. The growing group of millions with criminal records can experience this epistemic violence as we are defined and othered by the dominant group and subject to the worst effects of the biographic mediation process. So what is biographic mediation? It is a process that facilitates lasting discrimination by affixing labels that justify stigma, therefore exclusion. Institutions define the context for biographic mediation because institutional agents can demand prejudicial personal information as a requirement for access. From this vantage point, institutions can speak more authoritatively about personal history because they create the frameworks within which we must tell our stories.
That's right.
The institutionalization of organized prejudice and discrimination disorients the incarcerated and the formerly incarcerated at our space of being, and is thus enacted epistemic violence.
That's right.
So across the US, incarcerated and post-incarcerated scholars then, wanting to further their education, has to contend with this university exclusion, disqualification for housing, licensing, teaching assistant positions, and on. Many of us reel from the stigma of the blows that land when stigma is weaponized against us. When we're required to check that box on an application, when we're required to write these long disclosure statements, and the demand to produce records of the worst days of our life in order for a stranger to assess our worthiness. Checking a box to indicate a felony conviction in the past can transform administrators, faculty, and data entry clerks into what I love to call carceral agents, because they determine the weight of disclosure and its impact on eligibility. So the term carceral agent describes then these people who control access to resources for the formerly incarcerated. And I think that's important that we recognize that that's what they are and what they do, particularly because of the bureaucratic processes that are woven into getting access to higher education, and how they actually
work along this afterlife of incarceration that extends these logics into our everyday life. So these carceral agents are endowed with the power to establish who and what is normal, and require, as Foucault argues, that each individual, wherever he or she may find herself, must subject their body, their gestures, their behavior, their aptitudes, and their achievements to these processes. So our beingness as people who have served our time is attacked. In fact, academia is often complicit in racial criminalization and carceral gatekeeping practices of all types. Take, for example, my friend Donna. She committed a violent crime 20 years ago. Upon her release, now it's like 22 years ago. Upon her release, she followed every stipulation on parole. She applied to a graduate school to earn her master's degree in social work at a private public university. She was accepted in all ways by the sociology department, and they were very excited to enroll her. The university dean blocked Donna's application because the board decided that they would not fund the insurance to cover Donna for her practicum and or clinical requirements in order for her to earn her degree. So there's no law prohibiting her enrollment and her admission in this school. So the consequences for her criminal conviction are social and epistemic. I would also like to get us to think about the ways the liberal university extends or is an extension of the carceral state, and is therefore a site where an embedded prejudice against the post-incarcerated people is epistemic violence, in fact. So the question is not, should universities be more open and pursue and actively include post-incarcerated people? It's not about the role probation and parole should play. The question is, how will we respond to the structures that are in place that facilitate some university administrations in locking out the post-incarcerated from degree opportunities, either because they're on probation and parole or because of a crime of conviction? What will we do to change it? How will we stand up against it? Let's take a minute at some available research. So there was a survey conducted by the collegiate registrars and admission officers, and they conducted this research over criminal history screening and college admission procedures and a few years ago. And it's an old research, but I feel like the answers to these questions are instructive. Their findings are instructive. And there are 5. The first finding that they found through their research of finding about the impact of criminal history in admissions said, 1, there's no link between having a criminal record and posing a risk to campus safety. Some schools willingly provide an education to us while incarcerated, yet won't let us finish at their main campuses upon release. This is incongruous. In states where college programs exist or existed, how can they support the incarcerated earning a college education while locked up, but then deploy box processes, probation, parole, crime, and other prejudicial restrictions along with the taint of criminality once we're released? I'd even like to push a little further. What do these exclusionary practices do to our opportunity and our risks for recidivism? Studies show that, you guys know this, 40 to 68% of the newly released recidivate within 3 years. And a lot of you know Jared's story. Jared's story was he was incarcerated at a prominent university. He earned 2 bachelor's degrees while incarcerated. He worked at that university in their registrar school department. He had earned their trust. He was a valued employee at that institution for years. So he got an education from them, worked for them, then went home and applied at that same university, and they denied him not once, not twice, but 3 times. Jared received an education and served as an employee at the university. He's obviously known to staff as trustworthy and safe. If not, he would not have been allowed to serve as a clerk, yet he's deemed unworthy to attend the same school upon release. It is incidents such as this that the newly released are locked out of opportunity at the most critical time in our reentry process. And the university and its carceral agents put us in danger of recidivism. The liberal university then adds to the collateral consequences of incarceration and enacts epistemic violence. Now, It didn't happen to Jared because he was a strong person who had a lot of supports in place and he was fearless. But what about the people who are not, who did not help, who don't have the same level of support that Jared had? Ironically, these are the same institutions willing to educate people while they're in prison, sometimes benefiting from state or federal monies to do so, but treat us like cancers once we come home. One justification for these practices could be the need for, they say, for the need for campus safety. But sometimes people are thought more dangerous as a result of conviction incarceration. There's often a notion floating in the back of people's minds affecting how they treat people. So there's the truth invented and articulated, but it's disqualification that's enacted. So the second finding was, having a criminal record is not an unusual characteristic in American history, in America today. Well, we know that's true because 70 million people plus in this country have criminal records. The number is growing, and yes, some with crimes of violence. So it is not beyond the possibility to have several formerly incarcerated people applying to graduate schools and on. The potential for candidates for faculty positions and graduate education to have criminal records is real and evident. A criminal record is also growing more likely amongst high school students who are on this unfortunate school to prison pipeline, which targets Black and brown students through racialized law enforcement practices. There are many factors that add to the growing number of people with criminal records in this age of hyper-incarceration. So administrators need to simply do the math. The third finding, this is a civil rights issue. Well, there's more going on within this mass criminalization of the formerly incarcerated, where the university and its administrators enact epistemic violence by extending those logics into the field of a liberal education. Discrimination based on race, sex, and class and ascribed criminality is foundational to how the criminal legal system works. And then that feeds socially and culturally into the university that then gatekeeps their cultural and social capital that is produced through association with them. Is that not a hypocrisy of the spirit, a ceiling in the liberal democratic academy wherein university elites protect themselves and their schools from the tainted criminal? Universities and carceral agents need to let go of that exclusivity regardless of political trends, elitism, and a lack of anti-capitalist vision, especially if they have a higher education program in their schools, in their prisons. If there's a higher education program in your prison, in your university, and you are locking out those same students or other students for taking advantage and applying and going to school, you are so out the box, I can't even really have words for you. So to do otherwise is to position yourself as this university as an extension of the carceral state, a de facto carceral institution, much like probation and parole, that work to ensure the extension of carceral logics to those of us living in unfreedom. But let me be clear, this is not about inclusion and assimilation. The liberal university isn't a utopia. It is and has historically been a site of great contestation, violence, and discrimination. University higher education programs and prisons are not the promised land. How can they be when they are the offspring of universities that enact epistemic violence by their arbitrary use of biographic mediation processes? No, access to higher education is about countering the collateral consequences of criminal convictions, creating a pathway for people to have a transformative life and a better quality of life as a result of getting this education and having that and obtaining that degree. That's what it's about. So the fourth finding is criminal records are often inaccurate or misleading. We know this to be true. Background check websites often use software that scrape court databases for arrests and other data. But there's no guarantee that they regularly update those databases or effectively remove erroneous information or dismiss cases, or if the person was under 18. They also don't capture whether a state has certain provisions that allow young people with cases to legally avoid checking the box, nor that they account for typos and similarities in names. I'd also like to add that some university GSACs and other administration departments and their carceral agents are using background checks to eliminate formerly incarcerated applicants after a department or a school has chosen that student who disclosed appropriately during the application process. They're also using credit checks. This is the liberal university. For fifth finding, accepting college applicants with criminal records promotes public safety. So this is a crime results from a lack of employment opportunity argument, and argues that access to a higher education reduces recidivism. I would argue that a higher education isn't only about jobs. It's about one's quality of life, intellectually, socially, interpersonally, financially, etc. And people making this argument need to be careful. Because arguing that access to a higher education in prison reduces recidivism also makes the argument that people serving life without parole shouldn't have access because they're supposedly never going home. Of course, concern for the safety of students at university is important. However, fear of incarcerated people is not about the actual threat they impose, and more about the pervasive criminalization of post-incarcerated men and women in the era of hyper-incarceration. Also, most violence on campus is not from people who have had criminal histories.
That's right.
So those are the 5 points from the report, but I'd like to add another point. The 6th point I would add is that it limits critique. There are scholars coming out of mass incarceration who are able to interpret the lived experience of incarceration and synthesize its individual impact and societal consequences to academia and the world, as we have shown in the History Project, and you'll learn more about what we're doing in Indiana at the plenary tomorrow. As we have shown in Indiana, with our History Project at the Indiana Women's Prison, we have presented to state, national, and international conferences since 2014, and in this conference here since 2015. And we have shown that much can be accomplished when you epistemically privilege the experience of the incarcerated scholar. So our expertise, garnered from our experience of incarceration, can contribute to the academy. It is not a deficit. It is an asset if you see it such. So many of us have demonstrated our ability to make real change, and we're not anomalies. That is why it's tragic that public and some private universities, especially graduate and doctoral programs, practice exclusion and the disqualification of the formerly incarcerated, because at the heart it limits critique and counters any rhetoric these universities tout about being institutions that believe in fostering the global citizen, the transformative citizen. So what was the recommendation of the report? And I warn you, it's so obvious. College and universities should refrain from collecting and using criminal justice information in the context of college admissions. Well, this is particularly true when college universities across the country are banning the box. And a lot of the brilliant work done by Operation Restoration and all of the rest around the states that are doing this work. These people are banning the box at their universities, yet they still manage to enroll capable, eager, formerly incarcerated students. So here's my recommendation. An anti-discrimination clause in all university admissions applications, along with banning the box, would more aptly coincide with any university's commitments to provide all students with a liberal education. At the end of the day, epistemic violence enacted by the liberal university can only be mediated by activism. So who will do this work and what does it look like? First, it is local, national, and international coalition building among students, faculty, and university administrators who are committed to eliminating barriers to higher education. As a member of the American Studies Association and the Critical Prisons Caucus, I had the opportunity to work with faculty who are activists and some who are formerly incarcerated from universities all across the country in writing a white paper, which we titled Formerly Incarcerated Students and Workers, Best Practices for Universities. The paper identified and addressed barriers, logistical issues, informal issues, campus climate, financial, immigration, and ideological issues, with the goal of providing university students and faculty with the language and the facts they need to back up an argument for removing the barriers to college admissions for the formerly incarcerated in their own universities. So we all know that incarceration people are not a part of a protected status in the law. The 8th Amendment of the Constitution is supposed to confer protection against quote-unquote cruel and unusual punishment and permit civil rights lawsuits for violations, but it does not confer a right to education. Pell Grants were made available in 1962 and stripped away in 1994. The 1996 Prison Litigation Reform Act gravely weakened the 8th Amendment for incarcerated people seeking civil rights protections, and today, background checks and credit checks and all sorts of disclosure processes become effective tools of exclusion to screen applicants and employees. But it's important to note that the affirmative action in Title VII and equal opportunity statements, they are established in every single one of your universities. You can go Google one on your university site and find it now. And they are fashioned after the federal EEOC policy regarding non-discrimination of just about every marginalized and minority group you can think of, except for incarcerated and formerly incarcerated people. The language of the EEOC policy has phrases like prohibit discrimination based on one's protected status. Yet I would say, building off of the existing Title VII and the equal opportunity policy statements at your local universities, you, students and faculty, and program administrators can begin to craft a non-discrimination policy. Begin to have conversations with your university leadership about banning the box on college admissions applications and providing employment protections for TAs, RAs, and other formerly incarcerated employees. You can fight to end the biographic mediation processes that foster discrimination, and in so doing, you will need to radically reimagine a redistribution of funds and support to get it done. So in this coalition building, it's important that it's led by directly impacted people who are taking their own responsibility for change and being part of it. It is in sharing successful legislation, key insights into local representatives, administrators, and other stakeholders. The language of protected status from discrimination is already present for many classifications of people. The question is, what language will you and I need to use against those gatekeeping carceral agents to get the incarcerated and formerly incarcerated included as a legally protected group at your university? How do we mobilize our allies to support us and not hinder us? We answer these questions through coalition building, sharing and strategizing, relationship building, and recognizing that we must work at our individual universities and at the state and federal level at the same time. And like what's happening right now at Unlock Higher Education. And how many people have ever heard of Unlock Higher Ed? Represent. So Unlock Higher Education, for those in the room who don't know, was created by formerly incarcerated and non-incarcerated scholars and activists from Operation Restoration, College and Community Fellowship, Drug Policy Alliance, Prison to PhD, myself and many other people, and we're committed to state and federal legislation, public policy change for higher education in prison. We are advocating for the REAL Act, college affordability bills, ban the box, and ban the box across the country. We're advocating at the state and federal level to bring the voice of formerly incarcerated constituents to their legislatures. We're advocating to bring the voice of formerly incarcerated constituents to their legislators, even if those constituents can't vote. Because while you may have a great or decent superintendent, commissioner, or governor now, they will not likely remain in those positions. And there's no guarantee that you'll get anybody better. So we need public policy in place to protect this higher education and prison thing that we're building and we're structuring now, so that it can weather the changes of time and political, what do you want to call it? Political winds, thank you. Because it's critically important that all human beings be heard and have a voice. For those lawmakers who are sitting in their hollow mahogany offices, deciding what happens to the lives of incarcerated and formerly incarcerated people, they need to hear from those of us living under and impacted by the laws they craft on the ground. They cannot know the impact in its fullness unless they hear it from us. We can speak to the culture in a way that others can only describe. With that being said, I applaud every representative of a university here and the work that you do in bringing higher education programs to incarcerated students across the country. You are valuable beyond measure, particularly because I know a great deal of the challenges you face in creating, maintaining, and sustaining college programs in prisons that are often hostile. If your program is not, however, if your program is not conferring real credits to students, while that is a start, it is not a place to remain. Students who are doing real work deserve real credits.
That's right.
I know that a lot of people, assume that the initial relationship established with a department correction is unchangeable. But they are people, and people are holistically changeable. Establish an annual review of your program with the DOC and the university. Be bold and renegotiate what your program can do for your students while incarcerated and upon release. Don't be afraid to ask to do more. And if you're creating a new program, begin with many of these stipulations at the front end so that you're not trying to add them in the back end. Because now is not the time to rest. If your program is a single school and a pocket of people working hard, providing programming, you need to think about building a coalition of schools, expanding yourself beyond the pocket so that the oppression and the compression of working in prisons with the DOC is diffused across the coalition, minimizing the impact of any one school, department, or faculty. It is pulling away, you guys, from the tendency of university elitism. It is learning from, working with, and sharing credit with community-based organizations who know how to work in coalitions. Now is not the time to rest. If your program does not provide a path or created a network for formerly incarcerated students to complete their degrees upon release at the same school or other school, or it does not assist with the transition and overall support, you are actually a part of the carceral state. You are part of those things that are putting those students that you treasure at risk of recidivism. And so you have a lot of work to do. Now is not the time to rest. I applaud every representative of departments of corrections that are progressive in their views on higher education in prison. You guys actually create the space where students and faculty can work together. But if the facilities that you represent are using higher education as a means to discipline and therefore punish incarcerated students, you are missing the mark and acting counter to your own rhetoric of rehabilitation.
That's right.
You cannot let this stand because education is a right and transformative and must be protected. Therefore, a culture change is required. Push back against the tendency to be a carceral agent that reifies carceral logics of governance. Now is not the time to rest. I am thankful for those advocates and activists working on the full return of Pell, creating metrics to measure the quality of higher education programs, eliminating box processes on college admission applications, and calling out college administrators for using credit checks as a tool to exclude formerly incarcerated students, and fighting for college affordability overall. For y'all, I'm truly thankful. But if you've not begun to build broad-based coalitions that are bipartisan, comprised of formerly incarcerated students, representatives from departments of corrections, state and local, federal legislatures, wherein more than laws and regulations are changed, but through relationship building, hearts and minds are changed, changes in consciousness occur, wherein that productive othering of epistemic violence is effectively dismantled. Man, even as we celebrate our wins, right? And we've had them across the country, now is not the time to rest. So I applaud those formerly incarcerated men and women who, upon returning home, who persevered through university exclusions, the collateral consequences of criminal convictions, and other barriers to reentry to achieve your degree for yourself. But if you're not bringing to this movement some of your time, your talent, and your treasure in order to ease the passage for those who are unfortunately coming behind you until we dismantle the system, please be reminded that there were many who came before you that worked tirelessly so that you might benefit from a higher education, even while you were incarcerated. So for y'all, now is not the time to rest. I am a researcher, and I find a great deal in the research that has been conducted and will be conducted about incarcerated and formerly incarcerated students and the challenges inherent in mass criminalization. There's an amazing canon of research on containment and confinement in this country. More and more interest is being paid to those captured in the carceral state. Yet when some researchers objectify and thingify those who they extract information from our communities, never returning to share their findings with us so that we can mobilize on the ground, better informed by that which we are living in, you need to fundamentally rethink that process, and now is not the time to rest. There are 229 unique institutions that are affiliated with in-prison higher education. 202 are providing credits. A third of those schools are receiving funding from Second Chance Pell. As new programs are being developed, and that will take advantage of the current Second Chance Pell initiative, in addition to the full restoration of Pell, questions on how to ensure quality of coursework and university services, and how to provide greater equity in representations of men, women, and people of color, will require the work of all of us, especially those who actually experience a high quality education in prison. We need to be a part of developing those metrics and those public policy initiatives that will undergird it. So now is not the time to rest. Alliance for Higher Education in Prison, a body who is completely dedicated to this cause and who possesses the social and cultural capital necessary of any real change agent. In my abolitionist imaginary, I see AHEP playing a role, possibly becoming a clearinghouse and or an intercessor, actually helping incarcerated and formerly incarcerated students in applying to universities. As some of you know, the application periods are often 1 year in advance, and I would not have been able to apply without an intermediary because of online requirements of applications. And in my case, it was Dr. Kelsey Kaufman, who took some risks to do so while actively offering programming at the prison. AHEP could be that intermediary. AHEP could build the infrastructure, a reentry arm, and be a central location to connect and assist incarcerated students in applying for higher education in school, higher education after release, while they're incarcerated after release. Now is not the time to rest. AHEP could also establish a public policy statement on language. It has been frustrating that once again, non-people first language is being used at this conference. We've moved past this. We've had talks since 2015. Let's move on. AHEP put out and establish a public policy statement that the entire body can follow. AHEP could activate their social capital on public policy issues by supporting public policy organizations like Unlock and others with their time and their resources and so that we can continue to do the work that we're doing on the ground. AHEP could also assist small prison education programs in building consortiums. Because as I stated, a consortium's power is that coalition of universities that could diffuse some of the impact of dealing in hostile territory of departments of corrections. This national action would alleviate some of that pressure that those small universities are experiencing. So now is not the time to rest. Now, everyone here believes in education. Everyone here believes education is a right and are willing to do the work either as a student, faculty, administrator, or program administrator to make sure education happens. This is what we all have in common. This is why we gather at this conference. But I'd like to challenge you, as I have this whole evening. As educators, most people would argue that your job is just to teach students and not get involved in public policies in your universities. I would argue that one of the greatest imperatives of the educator is academic freedom. Academic freedom is not just for some, but for all. And this has been a real challenge for the liberal university. They have been cherry picking people for hundreds of years. So I would charge that as educators, you are also called to foster academic freedom for the formerly incarcerated and others involved with the criminal legal system, within and beyond the prison classroom. Kaya Stern said at a conference that I was at recently that human connection is contraband. Human connection is somehow a smuggled good.
That's right.
We have the power to change that. This body has the power to change that. Now is not the time to rest. So this is not about inclusion, indoctrination, or assimilation into the university or its culture. It's about countering the collateral consequences of criminal conviction, such as biographic mediation and epistemic violence. Giving us the access and letting us do what we do as we reflectively shape our world. Thank you.
We'll figure it out.